When I was 16, my parents threw me out of our home so my older sister could move back in with her boyfriend. It had always been clear that my parents didn't truly care for me, but it wasn't until my 16th birthday last week that I got undeniable proof. The day began like any other. No celebration, no cake. Then surprisingly, they presented a gift. It wasn't for me, though. It was for them. They were kicking me out. The reason? My older sister, Natalie. She's always been their favorite, their golden child. They never explained why, but I'm socially awkward and never had a girlfriend while she was popular in high school. Now she's 8 months pregnant. On the morning of my birthday, my parents woke me up and told me to start packing. We have 4 bedrooms, and they wanted one for the baby, one for my sister, and one for her boyfriend. All at my expense, of course. So, I was being sent to live with my uncle. I didn't even react. After a few minutes of awkward silence, they promised to cover all my expenses until I turned 18 as long as I wasn't living with them anymore. Natalie wasn't there during this conversation, and I immediately knew it was deliberate, so she wouldn't have to witness the mess and feel bad. I always thought we had a decent relationship, but in that moment, I realized my family genuinely didn't care about me, and she was no different. Like any 16-year-old being evicted on their birthday, I was devastated. But I understood that nothing I said could make them truly love me. So I spent my 16th birthday shoving all my things into trash bags. They helped me pack, though I suspect they were just trying to rush me out. Once I was ready, they even drove me to my uncle's place, chatting cheerfully the entire way. At one point, my mom, grinning widely, turned to my dad and said, "Hey, now that OP's gone, we can finally order some Indian food." When we arrived, I expected a hug goodbye or at least some words of encouragement. Instead, they just pulled over to the curb and sped off before I even reached the front door. When my uncle opened the door, I felt even worse. He immediately pulled me into a warm hug and welcomed me inside. I burst into tears, realizing just how awful my parents truly were. I ended up telling him everything that had happened. He seemed utterly shocked by my story and asked me to repeat it all. As I recounted the morning's events, his kind smile morphed into a furious scowl. Without a word, he grabbed his phone, muttered something about making a call, and vanished into another room. Suddenly, my uncle's voice boomed through the walls. This was completely unlike him. He rarely raises his voice and is usually very calm and soft-spoken. I instantly knew someone had genuinely infuriated him to provoke such an intense reaction. When he returned, his face was beet red with anger. I soon found out my parents were the cause of his rage. It turned out my dad, his own brother, had told him that I had actually suggested this living arrangement myself and was perfectly fine with leaving my childhood home to live with my uncle instead. This explained why my uncle had agreed to take me in. He thought it was my idea. After that call, he got me a pint of Ben & Jerry's ice cream. He apologized for not intervening sooner, saying, "Your parents are the adults in this situation, and your safety and happiness should have always been their priority." I choked up and sniffled, trying to hold back tears. Those were the exact words I'd longed to hear since I was 6, when my parents first told me I was worthless. But his reassurance wasn't enough. My parents had literally prioritized giving their spare room to Natalie's boyfriend, a 24-year-old with a stable job and his own apartment lease. So, I decided to expose my parents online and let the internet handle them. I wasn't sure if my uncle would approve, so I waited until he took his afternoon nap and then, without hesitation, I posted what had happened. I included every detail. The favoritism, the insults, and, of course, the near abandonment. By the time I hit post, tears were streaming down my face. I immediately turned my phone off, terrified of the repercussions. An hour later, when I turned it back on, I finally understood why people say, "Be careful what you post online." My story had gone viral, but to all the wrong people. The post had been seen by countless relatives, and my inbox was swamped with messages from my parents and even my sister. On the bright side, many family members had commented, expressing their support, and several had texted, offering any help I might need. That felt good, until I read my parents' messages, which were filled with rage and hostility. They were obviously furious about what I'd shared and demanded I delete the post immediately. My dad said truly horrible things, even writing that he wished I'd never been born. Painful, but not unexpected. My mom's messages were equally nasty, though my sister's stood out. She didn't say much, just asked if we could talk in person. Feeling completely overwhelmed by all the responses, I simply put my phone away again, ignoring everyone for the next few days. However, I did block my parents since I had no desire to communicate with them anymore. I knew they were legally obligated to support me financially until I turned 18, and beyond that, I saw no reason to stay in contact. Just then, my uncle woke up from his nap. He hurried into the living room where I'd been sitting since I arrived, and calmly asked if I'd posted anything online. After I showed him everything, he seemed perfectly fine with my approach. If my dad tried to contact him in the following days, my uncle never mentioned it to me because we simply carried on as if nothing had happened, which confirmed his complete support for my actions. That was all the validation I needed. For about a week, I had virtually no interaction with my parents. But then, as I was leaving school, they suddenly appeared, looking absolutely furious. My friends, who were fully aware of my situation, immediately formed a protective barrier around me, ensuring I wouldn't have to engage if I didn't want to. However, my parents kept shouting my name until I finally responded. I walked straight up to them and declared that I wanted nothing to do with them anymore. They completely ignored me, insisting I needed to come home with them immediately. I couldn't understand why they suddenly wanted me back, especially after making it crystal clear I meant nothing to them. It felt like a desperate attempt to salvage their reputation among relatives. So I refused to go anywhere until they explained what was going on, trying to make sense of this abrupt change in attitude. They seemed both enraged and determined to get me home. When they said they didn't want my friends to overhear, I told my buddies to step back so we could talk privately. Once my friends were out of earshot, they revealed their true motive. They needed me back because I wasn't responding to their calls or texts, and they had to reconcile with me to secure their inheritance. After my post went viral within our family, my grandparents had discovered everything. My dad's parents are extremely wealthy, and they threatened him, stating that if he continued to treat me this way, he would lose his entire inheritance. They declared that unless my parents made amends with me, treated me better, and made sure I felt loved and cared for, whatever my father was set to inherit would instead go to my uncle, who was taking care of me without obligation. My dad absolutely couldn't afford to lose this inheritance. We're talking about a significant amount of money. My parents themselves had decent combined incomes, but honestly, in their shoes, I'd probably want that inheritance too. The difference is, I would have been smart enough not to make it seem like they were doing me a favor by taking me back, because this wasn't about me at all. It was purely about their financial interests. Even then, they lacked the basic sense to even pretend they genuinely wanted me home. So I told them I couldn't care less about their inheritance and walked away without listening to another word, ignoring their shouts as I left. I caught the bus back to my uncle's place and described the confrontation at school, which annoyed him as well. To prevent future incidents, he's contacted his attorney about changing my custody arrangement. Legally, my parents still have rights over me, and that needs to change if I'm going to live permanently with my uncle. I also called my grandparents to thank them for intervening, but I explained that I genuinely didn't want to return to my parents. After just a few days with my uncle, I finally felt free for the first time. Living with my parents had been suffocating, and despite constantly hoping things would improve, they never did. My grandparents live in a different state, so we rarely see each other. During family gatherings and holidays, my parents always behaved perfectly. so my grandparents never witnessed how I was truly treated at home. It wasn't outright cruelty, but constant indifference and dismissal. Everything appeared normal on the surface, but anyone spending a few days with us would notice how they basically pretended I didn't exist while focusing entirely on my sister. After her pregnancy, it worsened dramatically, and I became completely invisible. I explained all this to my grandparents, who assured me that if living with my uncle was what I wanted, they would make it happen. If my parents surrendered their rights, my grandparents would ensure all my needs were covered. I felt optimistic after that conversation, thinking things were finally improving. But that feeling didn't last long, as I received an email from my dad several hours later. It wasn't hateful or cruel, just disappointingly manipulative. He claimed I shouldn't have publicly posted about the situation, since my grandparents would have heard about it anyway through my uncle. Now, beyond my grandparents' anger, he said they faced massive backlash from relatives and social isolation, which he considered unfair. He mentioned that some colleagues discovered the post because it appeared in their feeds when he was tagged. This caused problems at his workplace, and according to him, my actions created unnecessary drama in their lives. So, am I the jerk for posting about how my parents forced me out on my 16th birthday to give my pregnant sister's baby my bedroom? Before sharing what happened next, thank you everyone for taking the time to comment on my post. Your supportive words mean everything to me right now. Addressing questions about why I hadn't left before and waited for them to kick me out, especially with my grandparents and uncle willing to help. The truth is, I wasn't treated with outright cruelty. As I mentioned earlier, I wasn't actively abused, just consistently ignored and made to feel unwanted. While that's definitely a form of mistreatment, in my mind, I was grateful I wasn't being physically hurt or verbally attacked. I had shelter and food, so I convinced myself I was fine and didn't need to feel loved or valued. I'd normalized the neglect so completely that I didn't even recognize it as abnormal anymore. As for why I never reached out to extended family for help, I honestly didn't want to burden anyone. I constantly worried about what would happen if they refused and my parents found out I'd asked for help. That would have made my home situation significantly worse since my folks are obsessed with appearances. That's why I kept everything bottled up and suffered quietly. My uncle never offered to take me in because he didn't want to offend my parents. Plus, he wasn't sure I'd even want to live with him. So, while this didn't happen sooner, the way things unfolded organically probably worked out better in the end. It came late, but hey, better late than never, right? He's currently working with a lawyer to transfer custody rights to him, which is going to be a huge battle now that inheritance money is involved. But even if this goes to court, my grandparents and uncle have promised to fully support me. My uncle has been incredibly apologetic since I arrived because he's finally realized how neglected I was at home and feels terrible for never addressing it, thinking it wasn't his place to interfere. At least everything's out in the open now, with my family, and I'm feeling more hopeful about my future. Now, about my sister, Natalie. In my original post, I mentioned she texted asking to meet in person, but I ignored her message because I didn't know how to respond. She'd never been directly cruel to me. She just adopted our parents' distant behavior. Throughout my life, she remained aloof, but on the rare occasions we did interact, she was generally pleasant. I assumed the entire plan to kick me out for her boyfriend and baby was her idea, which felt like she was finally showing her true colors by actively harming me. So, I completely ghosted her message. Our relationship was always awkward and tense, but I still preferred her to our parents, since she'd at least be decent whenever we actually spoke. It wasn't her fault our parents favored her so obviously, so 3 days ago, when she texted again asking me to visit, I decided to call and ask why she wanted to see me. I refused to go back to my parents' house where I assumed she'd be, but, surprisingly, she told me she was staying at her boyfriend's apartment. She wasn't feeling well enough to go out due to her pregnancy, so she asked if I'd come over to discuss everything happening with our family. She mentioned having several important things to tell me face to face. Out of pure curiosity, I decided to visit. When I arrived, she immediately apologized for never defending me, even though she clearly knew our parents played favorites and consistently dismissed me. They constantly ignored my achievements while celebrating hers, and I was clearly the unwanted child. But she never tried to fix that. She admitted she just felt too uncomfortable confronting our parents, so she let it continue. Since I seemed to be handling the treatment okay, she felt less responsible to speak up. Now she realized how messed up the entire situation was and genuinely wanted to make amends. She also revealed that our parents never discussed the living arrangements with her at all. She was completely blindsided learning they'd kicked me out to accommodate her baby and boyfriend, claiming she had absolutely no idea this had happened. She never requested any such arrangement. Her actual plan was to stay with our parents only until the baby was a couple of months old before moving in with her boyfriend. She'd wanted to move out sooner, but stayed solely because our parents begged her to. However, after reading my post, she realized she couldn't continue enabling their behavior and moved out within a week. This sparked a massive fight with our parents, who insisted she was making a terrible decision. They're currently not even speaking because they accused her of being ungrateful and selfish, none of which is true since she never promised them anything. They just made assumptions. So all that drama was ultimately pointless, since my parents ended up losing both their kids. At least she apologized for being a crappy sister in person generally, which I forgave, because holding on to bitterness wasn't going to help me heal. We cleared the air completely, and she promised the same thing my uncle did, that from now on she'd always have my back, no matter what. It's been just under a week since my original post, and I haven't heard anything from my parents since that email, so I'm guessing they've finally given up trying to get me back. I'm pretty sure my grandparents intervened since they called midweek to assure me my parents wouldn't bother me at school or send more emails. I hadn't even mentioned Dad's email to them, so clearly there must have been some conversation between my parents and grandparents behind the scenes. I don't know exactly what was discussed, but it seems my parents have finally accepted defeat. Only 3 days since my last update, and today my uncle announced my parents have agreed to surrender their parental rights. The paperwork should be completed soon, and he'll officially take over legal custody. I'm experiencing seriously mixed emotions right now. On one hand, I'm thrilled to finally have a home where I don't constantly feel unwanted and irrelevant, but I'm also feeling strangely empty and melancholic about certain aspects. It feels surreal that this is actually happening, but ultimately, this is the right path forward. This is exactly what I needed. Hey everyone! A couple weeks have passed since my uncle officially became my legal guardian. Major win! I also discovered my parents only relinquished custody because after I told my grandparents I refused to return home. They presented my parents with an ultimatum: lose their entire inheritance or keep 50% of what they were originally going to receive, but give up custody and promise never to contact me again without my permission. Guess which option my parents chose? LOL. Not surprised whatsoever. And honestly, I couldn't care less because it just confirms I dodged a major bullet. Good riddance. I'm still regularly talking with my sister, though. My parents are desperately trying to reconcile with her before her due date, but she's demanding personal space right now and has told them to stop hounding her daily. At this point, I can't help but laugh at the absolute dumpster fire they've created for our family. But whatever, I'm happy living with my uncle.